The glass doors of Thompson Eco Solutions gleamed in the morning sun, reflecting a world that didn't see Emma for who she truly was. She clutched her worn leather bag tighter, feeling the weight of a secret that could change everything. But today, like every other day for the past 9 months, she would remain invisible. Welcome back. Tell me from which city you are watching me and what time it is there. Now, listen to this story. Emma Thompson had learned to make herself small. At 28, she moved through the corporate corridors like a whisper, her presence barely acknowledged by those who mattered. Her sensible flats clicked softly against the polished floors as she navigated toward her cramped desk in the back corner of the open office space. The irony wasn't lost on her that she worked in one of the city's most progressive companies, yet felt more invisible than ever. 9 months earlier, everything had been different. 9 months ago, she had been someone else entirely. But let me tell you about the morning that would begin her transformation. The morning James Parker decided to remind her exactly where she belonged in the corporate food chain. Emma arrived at 7:30, 30 minutes before anyone else. She always did. These quiet moments before the office filled with chatter and ringing phones were sacred to her. They belonged to her daughter Lily and the phone call that started every workday. "Mommy, I drew you a picture of a superhero," came the tiny voice through her phone's speaker. Emma's heart clenched as she imagined her 4-year-old's gap-toothed smile. What kind of superhero, baby? One who fixes broken things and makes mean people nice. If only it were that simple, Emma thought, glancing around the empty office. If only she possessed that kind of power in this glass tower where her ideas were dismissed before she finished speaking them. The elevator chimed, interrupting her moment of peace. James Parker strutted out, his expensive suit impeccably tailored, his confidence radiating from every pore. At 32, he had been promoted to operations manager 6 months ago, and he wore his authority like armor. "Thompson," his voice cut through the morning stillness. "Conference room, now." No good morning. No acknowledgement that she had arrived before him. Again. Just a command that made her stomach tighten with familiar dread. Have you ever worked for someone who made you feel like you were constantly walking on eggshells? Someone who wielded their power like a weapon? Emma gathered her files and followed him to the glass-walled conference room. Through the transparent walls, she could see her colleagues beginning to arrive, coffee cups in hand, their faces still soft with sleep. None of them looked her way. Why would they? She was just Emma Thompson, the single mom who kept her head down and her mouth shut. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that the woman who founded this company, who built it from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, had given Emma more than just a job. She had given her a legacy she wasn't ready to claim. James spread documents across the mahogany table with theatrical precision. The Riverside Community Center project, it's hemorrhaging money and behind schedule. Fix it. Emma's breath caught. The Riverside project was a disaster, everyone knew it. 3 different managers had already failed to salvage it. Now James was handing it to her like a poisoned gift. "Sir, I'd need access to the full budget reports and vendor contracts to understand what went wrong." James's laugh was sharp and cold. "You'll work with what I give you, Thompson, unless you think you're too good for the assignment." The question hung in the air like a blade. Emma felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up her neck, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course not, sir. When do you need my assessment?" "End of the week. 4 days. 4 days to untangle a project that had been failing for months, with limited access to information." Emma nodded because what choice did she have? She had a daughter to feed, rent to pay, and nowhere else to go. As she left the conference room, documents clutched against her chest, Emma caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. Through the window of the executive floor, she saw a familiar silhouette. Grace Thompson, the company founder, stood with her back to the window, her silver hair catching the morning light. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Grace's expression was unreadable, professional, distant. No one watching would ever guess that this powerful woman had once braided Emma's hair and sung her to sleep. No one would ever suspect that Grace Thompson was Emma's mother. The secret they shared was like a weight pressed against Emma's chest. Grace had insisted on it from the beginning. "You need to prove yourself on your own merit," she had said. "The moment people know you're my daughter, everything you accomplish will be questioned." So Emma had taken her father's surname, lived in a modest apartment across town, and endured every slight and dismissal without revealing the truth. She had watched other employees curry favor with Grace, not knowing they were speaking about her daughter with casual disrespect. But why had Grace agreed to this charade? What was she protecting Emma from? And was the protection worth the price Emma paid every single day? Emma returned to her desk, feeling the familiar isolation settle over her like a heavy coat. Around her, the office buzzed with activity. Conversations about weekend plans, lunch meetings, project updates. She existed on the periphery of it all, present but not seen, heard but not listened to. Maria Gonzalez, the one person Emma considered a friend, appeared at her desk with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Maria whispered, settling into the chair beside Emma's desk. "James gave me the Riverside project." Maria's eyes widened. "The graveyard? Emma, that's not an assignment, that's punishment. What did you do?" "I existed," Emma said quietly, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth spread through her fingers, a small comfort in an increasingly hostile world. Maria leaned closer. "You know what I heard? I heard James is desperately trying to prove himself to the executive board. Rumor is if he can't show significant improvements in the next quarter, he's out." This information settled into Emma's mind like a puzzle piece. James wasn't just arrogant, he was scared. Fear had a way of making people cruel, of turning insecurity into aggression. But understanding his motivations didn't make her situation any less precarious. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of spreadsheets and phone calls. Emma dove into the Riverside project files with determined focus, trying to make sense of the financial chaos. But every document she requested came back heavily redacted or delayed. Every vendor she tried to contact had been instructed to route communications through James's office. She was being set up to fail, and they both knew it. That evening, Emma sat in her small kitchen, helping Lily with finger paints while dinner simmered on the stove. The apartment was tiny, but it was theirs. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen from thrift stores and garage sales, each item representing a small victory in her battle for independence. "Mommy, why do you look sad?" Lily asked, her small hand touching Emma's cheek with paint-stained fingers. "Sometimes grown-ups have difficult days at work, baby, but it's okay. Tomorrow will be better." Even as she said the words, Emma wasn't sure she believed them. But children needed hope, needed to believe that the world was fundamentally good and fair. Protecting that innocence was worth every sacrifice Emma made. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, Emma pulled out a leather-bound ledger from her bedside drawer. It was old, its pages yellowed with age, filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. Grace had given it to her years ago, explaining that it contained the original financial records from when Thompson Eco Solutions was just a dream in a cramped apartment. "Your grandmother kept meticulous records," Grace had said. "She believed that understanding where you came from was the key to knowing where you were going." Emma ran her fingers over the faded ink, finding strange comfort in the familiar numbers and notations. Her grandmother had built something from nothing, had persevered through challenges that made Emma's current struggles seem small by comparison. But her grandmother had also had a partner, a community, a support system. Emma felt utterly alone. As she studied the ledger, something caught her attention. A notation about vendor payments, a system of checks and balances that seemed remarkably sophisticated for such a small operation. Her grandmother had been careful, methodical, protective of every dollar. An idea began to form in Emma's mind. If she could understand the principles that had guided the company's early success, perhaps she could apply them to the Riverside disaster. Perhaps she could find a way to succeed where others had failed. But first she would need access to information that James seemed determined to withhold. The next morning brought no relief from the pressure. James had scheduled a team meeting to discuss performance expectations, and Emma knew she was the primary target. She sat in the conference room, surrounded by colleagues who avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. "Some people seem to think that working here is a charity case," James began, his gaze finding Emma immediately. "Let me be clear. This company succeeds because we demand excellence from every employee, regardless of their personal circumstances." The emphasis on personal circumstances hit Emma like a physical blow. He was talking about her single motherhood, her struggles, her perceived weaknesses. Around the table, faces remained carefully neutral, but Emma could feel their discomfort, their relief that they weren't the target. "The Riverside project will be our test case," James continued. "If we can't salvage that disaster, it reflects poorly on all of us." Some team members have stepped up to take responsibility for this challenge. He made it sound like she had volunteered, like she had eagerly accepted an impossible task. Emma kept her expression carefully blank, but inside, anger was building. She had endured months of subtle humiliation, of being overlooked and undervalued. But this was different. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty. After the meeting, Emma found herself alone in the conference room, staring out at the city beyond the glass walls. Somewhere out there, other single mothers were fighting their own battles, facing their own James Parkers. Some were winning, some were losing. All were invisible to those who held the power to change their circumstances. Maria appeared in the doorway. "Emma, you okay?" "I'm fine," Emma lied, gathering her papers with hands that trembled slightly. "Just processing the project requirements." But Maria knew her too well. She closed the conference room door and sat across from Emma. "This isn't about the project, and we both know it. James is trying to push you out, but I don't understand why. You're one of the most competent people here." Emma looked at her friend, this woman who had become her anchor in a sea of corporate indifference. Maria deserved to know the truth, deserved to understand why Emma couldn't simply quit and find another job. But the secret she carried wasn't hers alone. It belonged to Grace, to the company, to a complex web of relationships and expectations that Emma was only beginning to understand. "Sometimes people need someone to blame when things go wrong," Emma said finally. "I'm convenient." That afternoon, Emma made a decision that would change the trajectory of her battle with James Parker. She would treat the Riverside project not as punishment, but as opportunity. If James wanted to test her, she would pass that test so decisively that he would have no choice but to acknowledge her competence. But first, she needed allies. Her first stop was the accounting department, specifically Helen Kim, a quiet woman in her 50s who had been with the company since its early days. Helen had always been kind to Emma, offering small smiles and occasional words of encouragement. Now Emma hoped that kindness extended to professional support. "Helen, I'm working on the Riverside project, and I was hoping you might help me understand the financial structure." Helen looked up from her computer, her expression immediately cautious. "Emma, you know I'd like to help, but James has been very specific about information access." "I'm not asking for anything confidential," Emma said carefully. "Just help me understand how our budgeting process typically works for community projects." For a moment, Helen seemed to weigh the request. Then she nodded toward an empty conference room. "Let's talk privately." Inside the conference room, Helen's demeanor shifted. The cautious employee disappeared, replaced by someone who had clearly been waiting for this conversation. "Emma, I've been with this company for 15 years. I've seen good managers and bad managers, but I've never seen anyone as destructive as James Parker." Helen's voice was low but fierce. "He's been making changes to vendor contracts without proper approval, cutting corners that could seriously damage our reputation." Emma's heart began to race. What kind of changes? Substituting cheaper materials, extending payment terms beyond what vendors agreed to, authorizing work without proper permits. The Riverside project isn't failing because of poor management. It's failing because it's been sabotaged from the inside. The revelation hit Emma like ice water. James hadn't given her an impossible task. He had given her a crime scene to clean up. And if the project continued to fail under her watch, she would be the one blamed for his misconduct. Helen, do you have any documentation of these changes? Helen hesitated, then pulled out a manila folder from beneath a stack of other papers. I've been keeping copies of everything just in case. Call it insurance. Emma accepted the folder with hands that shook slightly. Inside were photocopies of contracts, approval forms, and email chains that painted a clear picture of James's reckless decisions. The evidence was damning, but it was also dangerous. Exposing James would mean war, and Emma wasn't sure she was prepared for the battle that would follow. Why are you sharing this with me? Emma asked. Helen's smile was sad but determined. Because I have a daughter too, and I remember what it was like to be dismissed and undervalued because I was a working mother. Someone needs to stop James Parker before he destroys this company, and you might be the only one brave enough to do it. That evening, Emma sat at her kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed, the folder of evidence spread before her like pieces of a puzzle. Each document told part of a larger story, a pattern of arrogance and shortcuts that endangered not just the Riverside project, but the company's entire reputation. But exposing James meant risking everything. If she was wrong, if the evidence wasn't as damning as it appeared, she would lose her job. Lily would lose her home, her stability, her future. The stakes couldn't be higher. Emma picked up her phone and stared at Grace's contact information. One call could end this nightmare. One conversation could reveal the truth about their relationship and give Emma the protection she needed to fight back. But it would also prove James right. It would confirm that she couldn't succeed on her own merit, that she needed family connections to survive in the corporate world. Everything she had worked for, every sacrifice she had made to prove her independence, would be rendered meaningless. She put the phone down and reached for her grandmother's ledger instead. Her grandmother's notes were detailed and methodical, each expense justified and cross-referenced. But more than that, they revealed a philosophy of business that prioritized long-term relationships over short-term profits. Every vendor was treated fairly, every contract honored completely, every promise kept. It was the opposite of James Parker's approach to business, and it was the key to saving the Riverside project. Emma began to formulate a plan. If she could prove that the project's problems stemmed from James's cost-cutting measures, if she could demonstrate that returning to the company's founding principles would ensure success, she might be able to salvage both the project and her career. But it would require careful documentation, strategic thinking, and allies she wasn't sure she possessed. The next morning, Emma arrived at the office with new purpose. Instead of shrinking into the background, she walked with determined steps toward the Riverside project files. Instead of accepting James's limitations on information, she began building her own network of sources. Her first stop was the facilities manager, Bob Rodriguez, a man in his 60s who had worked construction before joining Thompson Eco Solutions. Bob had always been friendly but distant, treating Emma with the polite respect he showed all office workers. Bob, I'm working on the Riverside project, and I was hoping you could help me understand some of the construction challenges. Bob's weathered face creased into a frown. That project's been nothing but headaches from day one. What specifically do you want to know? Everything, Emma said simply. I want to understand why it's failing so I can figure out how to fix it. For the next hour, Bob walked Emma through the project's timeline, explaining how cost-cutting measures had led to substandard materials, how rushed schedules had resulted in permit violations, how lack of proper oversight had allowed problems to compound. The thing is, Bob said, lowering his voice, the original specs were solid. If we had followed the initial plan, this would have been one of our showcase projects. But then Parker started making changes. Emma documented everything, building a comprehensive picture of how the project had been derailed. With each conversation, Each piece of evidence, her confidence grew. She had been right to trust her instincts about James's incompetence. But more importantly, she had been right to believe that the project could be salvaged. But her investigation didn't go unnoticed. Thompson. James's voice cut across the office like a whip. My office, now. Emma saved her work and walked across the office, feeling the eyes of her colleagues following her progress. Through the glass walls of James's office, she could see him pacing like a caged animal, his usual composure cracked. I understand you've been asking questions about the Riverside project, he said before she had even closed the door. I'm trying to understand the scope of the challenges so I can develop an effective solution. Your job is to manage the project with the resources I provide, not to conduct an investigation into management decisions. Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the automatic response to authority that had kept her silent for so many months. But something had changed. The evidence folder locked in her desk drawer, Helen's trust, Bob's revelations. They had given her something she hadn't possessed before. They had given her power. Sir, with respect, I can't solve problems I don't understand. If there are underlying issues affecting the project's success, I need to address them. James's face darkened. Let me be very clear, Thompson. Your job is to do what I tell you to do, when I tell you to do it. If that's not something you can handle, perhaps you're not the right fit for this company. The threat hung between them like smoke. Emma could almost see the fork in the road before her. Submission or defiance, safety or truth, invisibility or courage. She thought about Lily, asleep in her small bed, dreaming of superheroes who fixed broken things. She thought about her grandmother, carefully recording every transaction in her ledger, building something lasting through integrity and hard work. She thought about Grace, watching from the executive floor, waiting to see what choice her daughter would make. I understand completely, Mr. Parker, Emma said quietly. I'll do exactly what needs to be done. The ambiguity of her response clearly frustrated him, but he couldn't find fault with her words. Emma left his office with her head held high, knowing she had crossed a line from which there was no return. That afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Emma's phone rang during her lunch break, Lily's daycare appearing on the caller ID. Ms. Thompson, this is Sarah from Bright Beginnings. Lily has a fever and we need you to pick her up immediately. Emma's heart sank. She glanced around the office, calculating the time she would lose, the work that would go undone, the additional ammunition she would be giving James to question her commitment. But Lily came first. Lily always came first. She gathered her things and approached Maria's desk. I have to leave. Lily's sick. Go, Maria said immediately. I'll cover for you if anyone asks. Emma drove across town to the daycare, her mind racing between concern for her daughter and anxiety about work. By the time she reached Bright Beginnings, Lily's fever had spiked to 101 degrees, and the daycare director recommended an immediate trip to the pediatrician. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of waiting rooms, worried conversations with doctors, and the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for a sick child. Lily's fever broke around 9 o'clock that evening, but she was still too unwell to return to daycare the next morning. Emma called in sick, knowing that James would view her absence as confirmation of his worst assumptions about working mothers. She spent the day alternating between caring for Lily and working remotely on the Riverside project, stealing moments between cartoon episodes and medicine schedules to review vendor contracts and construction timelines. It was during one of these stolen moments while Lily napped fitfully on the couch that Emma made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the financial records was a pattern of payments that made no sense. Vendor invoices that had been paid twice, construction materials that had been ordered but never delivered, permit fees that had been charged multiple times for the same work. The irregularities weren't just evidence of incompetence. They suggested something far more serious. Emma cross-referenced the payments with her grandmother's ledger, using the old accounting principles to trace the flow of money through the project. What she found made her stomach turn. Funds that should have gone to materials and labor had been systematically diverted, creating the very budget shortfalls that had doomed the project to failure. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. If Emma was right about what she was seeing, James Parker wasn't just incompetent. He was stealing from the company. But proving it would require resources she didn't have and allies she wasn't sure she could trust. More importantly, it would put her in direct conflict with someone who had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy careers that threatened his position. Emma looked down at her sleeping daughter, so small and vulnerable on the couch, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a lead blanket. Everything she did now would affect not just her own future, but Lily's as well. By the time Emma returned to work the following day, James had already moved to consolidate his position. He scheduled a department meeting for that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss project accountability and professional standards. Emma arrived at the conference room early, hoping to speak with some of her colleagues before the meeting began. Instead, she found James already there, spreading documents across the table with calculated precision. "Thompson, I was hoping we could have a private conversation before the meeting." Emma remained standing, her briefcase held protectively across her chest. "Of course. Your absence yesterday has caused some concern among the executive team. When someone takes on a high-profile project like Riverside, reliability becomes paramount." The accusation was delicately worded, but unmistakable. Emma thought about her sleeping daughter, about the pediatrician's worried expression, about the impossible choice between being a good mother and being perceived as a committed employee. "My daughter was ill. I took her to the doctor and stayed home to care for her, as any responsible parent would do." "Of course," James said, his tone suggesting anything but agreement. "But it does raise questions about whether someone with such significant personal responsibilities is the right fit for our most demanding projects." Emma felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the shame that working mothers know too well. But underneath the shame, anger was building, not just at James, but at a system that penalized women for the simple act of caring for their children. "Sir, I completed my work remotely yesterday. The project timeline hasn't been affected. Remote work is a privilege, not a right, Thompson, and privileges can be revoked." The threat was clear, but Emma had moved beyond fear into something more dangerous: determination. She had spent months accepting James's casual cruelty, his systematic undermining of her confidence and competence, but she would not allow him to use her love for her daughter as a weapon against her. "Is that all, Mr. Parker? I'd like to prepare for the meeting." James studied her face, clearly searching for signs of submission or defeat. Finding neither, he nodded curtly. "We'll continue this discussion later." The department meeting that followed was a masterclass in workplace manipulation. James presented the Riverside Project's challenges as a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough vetting in project assignments. He spoke about the need for reliable leadership and consistent availability, in ways that made it clear he was talking about Emma without naming her directly. Around the conference table, Emma's colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked sympathetic, others relieved that they weren't in James's crosshairs. None spoke up in her defense, but Emma no longer needed their defense. The evidence folder in her desk drawer had given her something more valuable than workplace sympathy. It had given her the truth. "Mr. Parker," Emma said quietly, interrupting his monologue about reliability, "I'd like to present my preliminary assessment of the Riverside project." James's surprise was visible for just a moment, before his professional mask slipped back into place. "That wasn't on the agenda, Thompson. I think the team would benefit from understanding the specific challenges we're facing and the solutions I've identified." Emma stood and moved to the whiteboard, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. For the next 20 minutes, she presented a comprehensive analysis of the Riverside project that left no doubt about its current problems or their sources. She detailed the timeline of cost-cutting measures, the impact of substandard materials, the delays caused by permit violations. She explained how each decision had created cascading problems that had ultimately doomed the project to failure. And she outlined a recovery plan that addressed each issue systematically and transparently. The room was silent when she finished. Even James seemed stunned by the thoroughness of her presentation. But Emma wasn't done yet. "The good news," she said, turning to face the group, "is that these problems are entirely fixable. If we return to the original specifications, honor our commitments to vendors, and follow proper oversight procedures, the Riverside project can still be one of our showcase successes." She sat down, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Around the table, her colleagues were looking at her with new respect. This wasn't the invisible single mother they had come to dismiss. This was a professional who had done her homework and found solutions where others had seen only problems. James cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of the meeting. "Thank you for that comprehensive overview, Thompson. We'll certainly take your recommendations under consideration." But Emma could see something else in his expression: fear. He knew she had uncovered more than project mismanagement. He knew she was dangerous. The meeting ended with polite applause and careful pleasantries, but Emma sensed a shift in the room's dynamic. Her colleagues were looking at her differently, speaking to her with new attention and respect. For the first time in months, she felt truly seen. Maria approached her desk afterward, her expression mixing admiration with concern. "Emma, that was incredible, but you just painted a target on your back. James isn't going to forget this." "I know," Emma said simply. "But I can't keep pretending that incompetence is acceptable just to avoid conflict." That evening, Emma sat in her grandmother's old rocking chair, holding Lily as they read together. Her daughter's fever had broken completely, and her natural energy was beginning to return. "Mommy, you seem different today," Lily observed with the uncanny perceptiveness of small children. "Different how, sweetie?" "Stronger, like the superhero in my picture." Emma smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of Lily's head. Maybe her daughter was right. Maybe she was finally becoming the person she had always been meant to be, someone who stood up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. But the next morning brought consequences she hadn't anticipated. Emma arrived at work to find her computer access had been restricted, her project files moved to a secure server she couldn't reach. A note on her desk requested her immediate presence in human resources. Susan Walsh, the HR director, was a kind woman in her 50s who had always treated Emma fairly. But today her expression was troubled and apologetic. "Emma, please sit down. We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your work on the Riverside project." Emma's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of concerns?" "There have been allegations of insubordination, unauthorized access to confidential files, and questions about your professional judgment in handling sensitive vendor relationships." Each accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. James had moved quickly to reframe her investigation as misconduct, her thoroughness as overreach, her competence as insubordination. "Susan, I can explain everything. The research I conducted was necessary to understand the project's problems and develop effective solutions. I'm sure your intentions were good, Emma, but the appearance of impropriety is sometimes as damaging as actual impropriety. We need to conduct a formal review of your actions." Emma felt the walls closing in around her. A formal review would mean months of uncertainty, limited access to work materials, and the constant shadow of potential termination. It was a career death sentence, carefully crafted to look like due process. "How long will this review take?" "These things can't be rushed. Probably 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer if the investigation reveals additional concerns." Emma thought about her rent, her car payment, Lily's daycare fees. She thought about the evidence folder in her desk drawer and the allies she had cultivated who were now probably distancing themselves to avoid guilt by association. "What happens to my work while this is ongoing?" "You'll be placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the review. The phrase hung in the air like a prison sentence. Administrative leave was corporate speak for professional limbo. Not quite fired, but no longer employed, no longer earning the income that kept her small life stable and secure. Emma left the HR office in a daze, her personal belongings packed in a cardboard box that felt like a symbol of everything she had lost. As she walked through the office toward the elevator, she felt the eyes of her colleagues following her progress. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, most simply relieved that the corporate axe had fallen on someone else. But as she waited for the elevator, Emma noticed something that made her pause. Through the window of the executive floor, Grace Thompson was standing at her office window, watching Emma's departure with an expression of carefully controlled emotion. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Emma saw something in her mother's face, regret, perhaps, or recognition of a battle that had gone too far. But Grace made no gesture, no acknowledgement beyond that brief moment of eye contact. The elevator doors opened and Emma stepped inside, her box of belongings balanced precariously in her arms. As the doors closed, she caught a final glimpse of the office that had been her world for the past year. It looked smaller from this perspective, less intimidating, more like what it really was, just another corporate battlefield where invisible people fought invisible wars. That afternoon, Emma sat at her kitchen table staring at a stack of bills that suddenly seemed insurmountable. Administrative leave meant partial pay at best, and only if the company felt generous. Her savings account, never robust, would cover perhaps 6 weeks of expenses. Lily was at daycare, unaware that their carefully constructed life was collapsing around them. Emma had perhaps 2 hours before she had to collect her daughter and explain why Mommy would be home more often now, why their routine was about to change dramatically. But instead of despair, Emma felt something unexpected: relief. For months, she had lived with the crushing weight of James Parker's harassment, the daily humiliation of being invisible and undervalued. Now, at least, the battle was in the open. The masks had been removed, and everyone could see the conflict for what it really was. Emma reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Helen Kim's number. The accounting department might be the key to everything. If Helen still had access to the evidence they had compiled together, if she was willing to risk her own position to support Emma's claims. "Helen, it's Emma Thompson. I need to ask you a favor." Half an hour later, Emma sat in a coffee shop across from the Thompson Eco Solutions building, waiting for Helen to arrive. Through the window, she could see employees coming and going, their lives continuing as normal while hers hung in uncertain balance. Helen arrived precisely on time, carrying a manila envelope that she placed carefully on the table between them. "Emma, I heard about what happened today. I want you to know that not everyone believes James's version of events." "What's in the envelope, Helen?" "Copies of everything we discussed, plus some additional documentation I've gathered since our last conversation. Bank records, vendor complaints, email chains that show a clear pattern of financial irregularities." Emma accepted the envelope with trembling hands. "Why are you doing this? You could lose your job." Helen's smile was sad but determined. "Because I'm 55 years old, and I've watched too many good people get destroyed by bad managers. Because I have grandchildren who deserve to grow up in a world where integrity matters more than politics. And because someone needs to stop James Parker before he destroys this company completely." That evening, Emma spread the documents across her living room floor, while Lily played with her blocks nearby. The evidence was overwhelming. A systematic pattern of financial manipulation that had not only doomed the Riverside project, but potentially compromised other company operations as well. But the documentation also revealed something else: evidence that Grace Thompson had been quietly investigating similar irregularities for months. Internal memos, audit requests, and budget reviews that suggested Emma's mother was already aware of James's misconduct. If that was true, then Emma's investigation hadn't been an act of insubordination. It had been a parallel effort that confirmed Grace's own suspicions. The formal HR complaint wasn't just an attack on Emma. It was an attempt to silence someone who had inadvertently stumbled onto a corporate scandal. Emma picked up her phone and stared at Grace's contact information. One call could clarify everything, could provide the context and support she needed to fight back against James's accusations. But it would also mean revealing the secret they had both worked so hard to protect, admitting that she couldn't succeed without family connections. Instead, Emma made a different call. "Maria, it's Emma. I need your help with something, and it might put you in a difficult position." An hour later, Maria sat on Emma's living room floor, helping to organize documents and piece together the timeline of James's misconduct. As a senior analyst, Maria had access to systems and information that could fill in crucial gaps in Emma's evidence. "This is bigger than just the Riverside project," Maria said, studying a particularly damning email chain. "Look at these vendor payment authorizations. James has been systematically overpaying certain suppliers and pocketing the difference. Can you prove that? With the right access, yes. But Emma, this is dangerous territory. If James is willing to steal from the company, what do you think he'll do to people who threaten to expose him?" Emma looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep on the carpet surrounded by her toys. Her daughter's face was peaceful, trusting, innocent of the adult world's complexities and cruelties. Every decision Emma made now would affect this small person who depended on her for everything. "He's already done his worst to me," Emma said quietly. "What else can he take?" But even as she spoke the words, Emma knew they weren't entirely true. James could escalate his attacks, could make her unemployable in their industry, could force her to start over in a new career with no connections and no references. The power of destruction in corporate environments was nearly limitless for those willing to wield it without conscience. Over the weekend, Emma developed a strategy that was equal parts desperate and methodical. She would document every aspect of James's misconduct, build an airtight case that even the most skeptical reviewer couldn't dismiss. But she would also prepare for the possibility that justice might not prevail, that corporate politics might triumph over evidence and truth. She researched employment lawyers, investigating which firms had experience with whistleblower cases and corporate retaliation. She updated her resume and began reaching out to contacts at other companies, testing the job market while she still had time to be selective. Most importantly, she began preparing Lily for the possibility of significant changes in their life. Without frightening her daughter, Emma started conversations about resilience, about how sometimes good people face challenges that require them to be brave and strong. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" Lily asked on Sunday evening as they prepared for another uncertain week. "We're going to be more than okay, sweetheart. We're going to be proud of ourselves for doing the right thing, even when it's difficult." Emma hoped she was telling the truth. Monday morning brought an unexpected development that changed everything. Emma's phone rang at 7:30, just as she was making breakfast for Lily. The caller ID showed Thompson Eco Solutions' main number. "Ms. Thompson, this is Grace Thompson's office. She'd like to schedule a meeting with you for this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Emma's heart began to race. Grace had never requested a direct meeting before, had always maintained the careful distance that protected their secret relationship. Something significant had happened to break that pattern. "I'll be there," Emma said simply. At exactly 2 o'clock, Emma sat in the reception area outside Grace's executive office, feeling like she was about to have the most important conversation of her life. The space was elegant but understated, decorated with photos from the company's early days and awards recognizing their environmental initiatives. Grace's assistant, a kind woman named Patricia, offered coffee and apologetic smiles while Emma waited. Through the closed office door, Emma could hear muffled voices engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion. Finally, the door opened, and James Parker emerged, his face flushed with anger and barely contained frustration. He saw Emma sitting in the reception area, and his expression darkened further, but he said nothing as he stalked past toward the elevator. "Ms. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson will see you now," Patricia said gently. Emma entered her mother's office for the first time in over a year. Grace stood behind her desk, her expression carefully professional, but her eyes betraying the emotional weight of their situation. "Please, sit down." They faced each other across the mahogany desk like strangers, like CEO and employee, like anything other than mother and daughter. The distance felt enormous and unbridgeable. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here," Grace began. "I assume it has something to do with James Parker and his accusations against me." Grace nodded slowly. "Emma, I want you to understand something. When we decided to keep your relationship to me confidential, it was to protect you from exactly this kind of situation. But I'm beginning to think our strategy may have created more problems than it solved." Emma leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" "James Parker has been under investigation by our board for the past 3 months. His financial irregularities, his management style, his treatment of employees, everything has been documented and reviewed. We were building a case for his termination when he launched his attack against you." The revelation hit Emma like cold water. Grace had known about James's misconduct all along, had been working to address it through proper channels while Emma fought her lonely battle from below. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to succeed on your own merit, without the complications that come with being the founder's daughter. But also because I was afraid that knowledge of the investigation might compromise your safety in the workplace." Emma felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "So what happens now?" Grace stood and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. "Now we have a choice to make. I can continue to maintain our secret and let the board's investigation proceed at its own pace, which might take months. Or we can acknowledge our relationship and use that revelation to accelerate James's removal and your vindication." The choice laid out before them was clear but complex. Revealing their relationship would end Emma's professional independence, but might also end her professional torment. Maintaining the secret would preserve her integrity, but might not be enough to save her career. "There's something else you need to know," Grace continued. "James has escalated his complaints against you. He's alleging that you've been stealing from the company, using your access to project funds for personal expenses." Emma's breath caught. "That's completely false." "I know it is. But false accusations can be as damaging as true ones if they're not addressed quickly and decisively." Emma stood and joined her mother at the window. Below them, employees were going about their daily routines, unaware of the drama playing out in the executive suite. For a moment, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to have Grace's protection, to stand behind the shield of family connection and corporate power. But the price of that protection was everything she had worked to achieve independently. "I want to fight this on my own terms," Emma said finally. "I have evidence of James's misconduct. I have witnesses who can testify to his pattern of harassment and financial irregularities. I want to prove my case without using our relationship as leverage." Grace turned to face her daughter, and for the first time since Emma had entered the office, her professional mask slipped slightly. "Emma, I admire your integrity, but I won't stand by and watch someone destroy your career with lies and manipulation." "Give me 2 weeks," Emma said. "Let me try to resolve this through the proper channels first. If I can't make progress, then we'll reconsider our options." Grace studied her daughter's face, seeing echoes of her own determination and stubbornness. 2 weeks. But Emma, if James escalates his attacks, if he tries to damage you beyond repair, I won't wait for your permission to intervene." Emma left the meeting with mixed feelings. She had bought herself time, but she had also set expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. 2 weeks to gather evidence, build allies, and present a case that would not only clear her name, but expose James Parker's misconduct in a way that left no room for doubt or interpretation. That evening, Emma called an emergency meeting with her small circle of allies. Maria and Helen arrived at her apartment after work, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation they all faced. James has accused me of financial misconduct, Emma said without preamble. We have 14 days to prove not only that the accusations are false, but that he's the one who's been stealing from the company. Helen pulled out her laptop and a stack of documents. I've been busy since we last talked. I found evidence of at least 12 instances of fraudulent vendor payments, plus several cases where materials were ordered, but diverted to other projects without proper authorization. Maria spread her own research across Emma's coffee table. And I've been talking to people in other departments. Emma, you're not James's first target. He's systematically intimidated or eliminated anyone who questioned his decisions. There's a pattern of retaliation that goes back to his first month as manager. For the next 3 hours, they constructed a comprehensive timeline of James Parker's misconduct, cross-referencing financial irregularities with personnel actions, vendor complaints with budget overruns. The picture that emerged was of a manager who had turned an entire department into his personal kingdom, ruling through fear and enriching himself through systematic theft. But evidence was only half the battle. They also needed a strategy for presenting their findings in a way that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. More importantly, they needed to do it in a way that protected all 3 women from retaliation if their accusations were rejected. I have an idea, Emma said as the evening wore on. What if we present this to the board of directors directly, bypassing James and HR entirely? Maria looked skeptical. Emma, you can't just walk into a board meeting and start making accusations. There are protocols, procedures. Not for whistleblower complaints, Helen said quietly. Corporate policy allows employees to report suspected fraud directly to the board if they believe their immediate supervisors are involved in the misconduct. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Going directly to the board was the nuclear option, the approach that would either completely vindicate Emma or completely destroy her. There would be no middle ground, no room for partial victories or face-saving compromises. If we do this, Emma said, we need to be absolutely certain of our facts. One mistake, one document that can't be verified, one witness who changes their story, and James wins everything. Helen and Maria exchanged glances, both understanding the magnitude of what Emma was proposing. They weren't just risking their own careers. They were betting everything on the possibility that justice and truth could triumph over politics and power. I'm in, Helen said firmly. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between right and wrong. James Parker is wrong, and someone needs to stop him. Maria nodded. My daughter asks me every day what I do at work, and I want to be able to tell her that I help good people succeed. Emma is good people. Over the next 10 days, the 3 women worked with an intensity and focus that surprised even them. They compiled evidence, verified sources, and constructed a presentation that methodically dismantled James Parker's version of events while building an airtight case for his removal. Emma discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. An eye for detail that could spot inconsistencies in complex financial records, a strategic mind that could anticipate and counter potential objections, a quiet charisma that inspired loyalty and trust in others. But James wasn't passive during this period. He continued his own campaign of intimidation and misdirection, spreading rumors about Emma's instability and desperate accusations, using his position to limit her supporters' access to information and resources. The battle lines were drawn clearly now. On one side stood James Parker with all the institutional power of his position, his connections within the company hierarchy, and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened him. On the other side stood 3 women with nothing but evidence, integrity, and a shared commitment to justice. The odds were not in their favor. But Emma had learned something important during her months of invisible struggle. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against arrogance and cruelty was simple, persistent truth. Sometimes the people who seemed weakest were actually strongest, because they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. On the 13th day of her 2-week deadline, Emma received a call that changed everything one final time. Ms. Thompson, This is Patricia from Mrs. Thompson's office. The board of directors has agreed to hear your presentation tomorrow at 9 a.m. You'll have 30 minutes to present your findings and answer questions. Emma hung up the phone with hands that trembled slightly. After months of preparation, investigation, and careful strategy, everything would be decided in a single half-hour presentation to people who held her professional fate in their hands. That evening, Emma sat with Lily as they shared dinner and went through their usual bedtime routine. Her daughter seemed to sense the importance of the approaching day, clinging a little closer during story time, asking more questions than usual about whether everything was going to be okay. "Mommy has an important meeting tomorrow," Emma explained. "I'm going to talk to some very important people about making sure everyone at work is treated fairly." "Like the superhero in my picture?" Emma smiled, thinking about the drawing that still hung on their refrigerator, a figure in a cape who fixed broken things and made mean people nice. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like the superhero in your picture." After Lily was asleep, Emma reviewed her presentation one final time. The evidence was compelling, the timeline was clear, and the conclusions were inescapable. James Parker had systematically defrauded Thompson Eco Solutions while using his position to intimidate and silence anyone who might expose his misconduct. But Emma also knew that evidence wasn't always enough in corporate environments. Politics, relationships, and perception often mattered more than facts. Tomorrow's meeting would test not just the strength of her case, but the integrity of the system she was challenging. Emma looked at the framed photo on her bedside table, a picture of herself, Grace, and her grandmother taken years before the corporate world had complicated their relationships. 3 generations of women, each strong in her own way, each fighting battles that the others might never fully understand. Tomorrow, Emma would discover whether the battles had been worth fighting. At exactly 9 a.m., Emma walked into Thompson Eco Solutions' main conference room, her presentation materials organized in a leather portfolio that had been her graduation gift from Grace. The board of directors sat around the mahogany table, 7 people whose faces reflected varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and professional caution. Grace sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes meeting Emma's for just a moment in a gesture of silent support. James Parker sat to her left, his confidence mask perfectly in place despite whatever private doubts he might be harboring. "Ms. Thompson," said Robert Martinez, the board chairman, "we understand you have concerns about financial irregularities in the Riverside Community Center project. You have 30 minutes to present your findings." Emma stood and walked to the presentation screen, her movements calm and deliberate, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. For months she had been invisible, dismissed, undervalued. Today, finally, she would be heard. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez. What I'm about to show you represents not just financial misconduct, but a systematic pattern of theft, intimidation, and fraud that threatens the very foundation of this company's reputation and success." For the next 25 minutes, Emma presented her case with methodical precision. She showed bank records that revealed unauthorized payments, vendor contracts that had been altered without approval, and a timeline that proved James Parker had been systematically stealing from company projects for months. She presented testimony from vendors who had been pressured to submit false invoices, construction workers who had been asked to use substandard materials, and accounting staff who had been intimidated into silence when they questioned irregular transactions. Most damaging of all, she presented email evidence showing that James had deliberately sabotaged the Riverside project to hide his own misconduct, then attempted to frame Emma for the resulting problems. The room was completely silent when she finished. James Parker's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate look of a man watching his carefully constructed lies crumble around him. "Ms. Thompson," said board member Sarah Chen, "these are very serious accusations. Do you have corroborating witnesses for these claims?" "Yes, ma'am. Helen Kim from accounting and several vendor representatives are prepared to testify under oath about their experiences with Mr. Parker's management practices." James finally found his voice. "This is absolutely outrageous. Ms. Thompson is clearly trying to deflect attention from her own incompetence and misconduct. These allegations are fabricated, desperate attempts to save her own career." Emma turned to face him directly. "Mr. Parker, would you be willing to submit to an independent audit of your financial decisions over the past year?" The question hung in the air like a sword. James's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. In that moment of silence, everyone in the room understood that Emma's accusations were not only true but provable. "I think we've heard enough," said Robert Martinez. "Mr. Parker, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building." James stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. "This is insane. You're destroying this company over the lies of a disgruntled employee who couldn't handle the pressure of real responsibility." But his protests fell on ears that had already heard enough. 2 security guards appeared at the conference room door, and James Parker was escorted from the building in full view of the employees he had terrorized for months. Emma remained standing at the presentation screen, hardly believing that the battle she had fought for so long was finally over. Around the conference table, board members were asking questions, taking notes, beginning the process of damage assessment and recovery planning. "Ms. Thompson," Grace said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and relief, "on behalf of the board, I want to thank you for your courage in bringing these issues to our attention. Your investigation has undoubtedly saved this company from significant financial and reputational damage." Emma nodded, accepting the praise while trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. She had won. Not just the battle against James Parker, but the larger war for her own dignity and professional respect. "There is one more thing," Robert Martinez said. "Given your thorough understanding of the Riverside project and your obvious management capabilities, the board would like to offer you James Parker's former position as operations manager." The offer hung in the air like a gift Emma had never dared to imagine. Operations manager meant real authority, significant salary increase, and the kind of professional respect she had been seeking throughout her career. It also meant that her victory over James Parker was complete. She hadn't just defeated her tormentor, she had replaced him. But Emma also understood the symbolic weight of the moment. Accepting the promotion would mean acknowledging that she had succeeded on her own merit, without family connections or special favors. It would validate every sacrifice she had made, every humiliation she had endured, every night she had worked late while Lily slept nearby. "I accept," Emma said simply. "And I promise you won't regret this decision." That afternoon, Emma walked through the office as the new operations manager, receiving congratulations from colleagues who had witnessed her transformation from invisible single mother to vindicated leader. The same people who had avoided eye contact during her months of struggle now sought her attention, her approval, her leadership. Maria embraced her warmly. "I always knew you had this strength in you. I just wasn't sure you knew it." Helen smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Your grandmother would have been proud of you today. You fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous." But the most meaningful moment came when Emma returned to her apartment that evening to find Lily waiting with a new drawing. This one showed 2 superheroes, one tall and one small, standing together in front of a large building. "That's you and me, Mommy," Lily explained. "We're both superheroes now." Emma knelt down and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, feeling the weight of the past months finally lifting from her shoulders. She had faced down arrogance and cruelty, had stood up to powerful people who tried to make her invisible, had proved that integrity and persistence could triumph over politics and intimidation. But more importantly, she had shown her daughter that being strong didn't mean being loud, that being powerful didn't require hurting others, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who seemed to have no power at all. 6 months later, Emma stood in the same conference room where she had presented her case against James Parker, but now she was leading a meeting about the successful completion of the Riverside Community Center project. The building had been finished on time and under budget, transformed from a symbol of corporate failure into a showcase of what Thompson Eco Solutions could accomplish when led by people who valued integrity over expediency. Through the conference room's glass walls, Emma could see Grace working at her desk on the executive floor. Their relationship remained professionally discreet but personally warm, a balance they had achieved after many careful conversations about boundaries, expectations, and mutual respect. James Parker had been prosecuted for embezzlement and was serving 18 months in federal prison. The investigation had revealed that his theft had totaled nearly $500,000, money he had used to fund a lifestyle far beyond his legitimate income. Several other companies had come forward with similar experiences, confirming that Emma's victory had prevented him from victimizing other employers and employees. But Emma's greatest satisfaction came not from James's punishment, but from the changes she had made as operations manager. The department's culture had been transformed from one of fear and intimidation to one of collaboration and mutual support. Employees felt heard, valued, and respected in ways that had been impossible under James's leadership. Emma had also instituted new policies for supporting working parents, creating flexible schedules and remote work options that allowed people to balance professional responsibilities with family obligations. No one would ever again be made to feel ashamed for caring for a sick child or attending a school event. "Ms. Thompson?" Patricia's voice came through the conference room speakerphone. "There's someone here to see you." Emma looked up to see a young woman standing in the reception area, holding a resume and looking nervous but determined. She was probably in her mid-20s, professionally dressed but carrying herself with the particular combination of hope and desperation that Emma recognized immediately. "Send her in," Emma said. The young woman entered the conference room and extended her hand. "Ms. Thompson, I'm Jessica Rodriguez. I'm a single mother, and I heard that this company treats working parents fairly. I was hoping you might have time to discuss potential opportunities." Emma smiled, seeing herself reflected in this young woman's earnest expression and careful presentation. "Please sit down. Tell me about yourself and what you're looking for." As Jessica began to speak about her background and goals, Emma felt the satisfying completion of a circle that had begun with her own desperate search for opportunity and respect. She was no longer the invisible woman seeking recognition. She had become the person who could provide recognition to others who deserved it. But more than that, Emma had learned that true strength came not from never falling down, but from getting back up each time and helping others do the same. She had faced the worst that workplace arrogance and cruelty could offer, and she had not only survived but prevailed. The superhero in Lily's drawing had been right all along. Some people really could fix broken things and make mean people nice. Sometimes it just took longer than anyone expected, and sometimes the superhero looked exactly like the person everyone else had overlooked. Emma listened to Jessica's story with the attention and respect she had once craved for herself, knowing that every person deserved to be seen, heard, and valued for their contributions. The invisible had become visible, the dismissed had become the decision-maker, and the cycle of transformation continued. In her desk drawer, Emma still kept her grandmother's old ledger, its pages now supplemented with her own careful records of the department's progress under her leadership. The numbers told a story of growth, efficiency, and success, but they also told a deeper story of what happened when people were treated with dignity and given the opportunity to prove their worth. As the meeting with Jessica continued, Emma caught a glimpse of her reflection in the conference room's glass wall. The woman looking back at her was confident, professional, and genuinely at peace with herself and her achievements. She had earned every aspect of her success through merit, integrity, and sheer determination. The invisible woman had finally learned to see herself clearly, and in doing so, had become impossible for anyone else to ignore. Have you ever lived through or known someone who went through something similar? Have you ever felt invisible in your workplace, dismissed because of your circumstances, or undervalued despite your contributions? Have you ever had to choose between standing up for what's right and protecting your security? Emma's story reminds us that transformation is possible, that dignity can be reclaimed, and that the people who seem most powerless sometimes possess the greatest strength of all. Her journey from invisible single mother to respected leader wasn't just about career advancement. It was about refusing to let other people's prejudices and cruelties define her worth. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never intended to become warriors, who simply refused to accept that being unseen was their permanent fate. Emma's victory wasn't just personal. It created ripples that would affect every person who worked for Thompson Eco Solutions, every parent who needed flexibility, every employee who deserved respect. The superhero in Lily's drawing wasn't wearing a cape or flying through the sky. She was simply a woman who decided that broken things could be fixed and that mean people could be stopped, one act of courage at a time. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible or undervalued, remember that your worth isn't determined by how others see you. It's determined by how you choose to see yourself and how you treat others along the way. Give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones, because everyone deserves to know that their story matters, that their struggles have meaning, and that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to fight for it.